Imagine waking up in 1347 as a medieval peasant in a muddy, overcrowded village. Your neighbor is screaming, and their skin is covered in strange black swollen lumps. You immediately know what has gotten to them: the Black Plague. It has become your worst enemy, and everyone else in the village feels the same way, but for some reason, no one knows how to stop it. If the Black Death continues, half of Europe will be gone within a few years. So the one question that runs through your mind is, how can you survive it? Today, we're doing a deep dive into the horrible Black Death of 1347, and you won't believe some of the things medieval peasants did to stay alive when things got deadlier. If you're into real stories from the past, then hit that like button and subscribe to join us for more wild rides through history. The Black Death arrives. The Black Death started with complaints of just a headache. Then there were reports of fever that continued to rise both in the number of affected persons and intensity. Next came the swelling, huge, black, painful lumps in the neck, armpits, or groin. These were called buboes, and they smelled terrible. Affected people would vomit, collapse, and within 2 or 3 days they would be pronounced dead. Some died screaming, others died in silence. It didn't matter how old you were, how strong, or how rich. If the plague reached you, your odds of survival were terrifyingly low. Historians estimate that between 30% to 50% of Europe's population died in just a few years. In Florence alone, 80% of the city was dead by 1348. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and for peasants, things were even worse. Life before the plague was already brutally hard. Most peasants lived in small wooden huts with straw roofs, packed tightly with their family members and animals. There was no plumbing, soap, or clean water. All they had was mud, fleas, and waste. People were always hungry because harvests failed often, and they rarely ate meat. Their immune systems were already weak, so when the plague came, there was no avoiding it. A single sneeze or cough could spread the sickness through an entire household. You didn't even need to touch a dying person. Just being near them was enough. Rats carrying fleas spread it fast, and in these cramped, unsanitary homes, fleas easily jumped from person to another. It became an everyday routine for parents to watch their child cough up blood. Married partners saw their spouse collapse in the corner, and neighbors' houses went quiet all at once. It simply felt like the end of the world. As much as the medieval peasants tried to stay safe or ward off the evil, they still didn't stand a chance. The plague killed nobles, beggars, priests, thieves, and even struggling peasants. The first time they realized the plague had arrived was when their relatives started bleeding from the eyes or collapsing in the fields. With no doctors or medicines, there was nothing they could do but watch it happen. The church bells, once used to mark births or weddings, now rang endlessly as the number of the dead increased and dead bodies piled up. No one understood what was really causing it or what was even going on. Many peasants believed it was a punishment from God for their sins. Others thought it came from bad smells, poisoned air, or even the alignment of the planets. Some blamed outsiders like Jewish communities, and this made violence quickly break out in many places, but none of these beliefs helped. The truth was much simpler, but they had no idea. The plague was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that lived on rats, and those rats were everywhere. Ships had brought them from Asia to Europe, and once the rats got into cities, the fleas jumped onto humans. Antibiotics, which actually kill the bacteria, weren't discovered until 1928, almost 600 years later. So, as far as the 14th century was concerned, this was a disease with no real cure. Soon enough, the disease spread on foot, on carts, and through villages, hitting rural peasants the hardest. All the members of different families started to die within a week, with no one left to bury them. You could die alone in a locked house and no one would even knock to know you just breathed your last. After being the peasants' biggest worry for so long, something started to happen. Survival. Before we get to how this survival was possible, let's see why so many didn't make it. Why the Black Death was so deadly for peasants. Ignorance was one of the major reasons the Black Death hit peasants. None of them understood what they were dealing with. They didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or even how diseases spread. There were no microscopes, germ theory, or labs, so they could only make guesses based on what seemed logical at the time. Many believed illness came from invisible poisons in the air, which they called miasma. So instead of treating the real source, they tried to fix the air. They burned herbs, wore masks stuffed with flowers, or hung perfumes around their homes, hoping the smells would block the sickness, but none of it worked. Even local healers, whom peasants sometimes trusted more than their priests, were helpless. Most treatments were based on superstition, astrology, or old books full of nonsense, and since peasants didn't have access to trained physicians, even if those doctors weren't much better, it meant that once someone got sick, everyone around them was basically on their own. Another major problem was that peasants were stuck in place. In the 1300s, most of them lived under a feudal system, which meant they didn't own their homes or land. They worked for a local lord, and in return, they got permission to farm small plots and live in basic housing, but that also meant one thing. They couldn't just leave when things got dangerous. If the people in a nearby town were getting wiped out by the plague, most peasants had no real way to escape. They didn't have horses or wagons, and even if they did, roads were too risky, and they probably wouldn't survive the journey. Lords often expected them to stay and keep working no matter what, and quite frankly, the peasants didn't have a choice not to. Unlike the rich, who could leave the cities and hide out in the countryside, poor villagers had no backup plan. Some peasants took the risk regardless and left their village. They left everything behind and headed for the woods, the hills, or any place far from the main roads. Some found abandoned huts or caves, others camped in fields. It wasn't comfortable or safe, but it felt better than staying put. Some towns did try to enforce quarantines for those who stayed behind, but in remote villages, those rules were either ignored or impossible to manage, so being a peasant in a world without proper borders or organized health systems meant you probably only had a few days to live once there was a disease outbreak. As if these problems weren't enough, fear made things even worse. Because people didn't understand what was killing them, they started to look for someone to blame. Many started to accuse their next-door neighbors of sorcery or cursing the village, but there was one horrible consequence of this fear: scapegoating certain communities, especially Jewish people. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells or causing the plague on purpose, even though they were dying from the disease too. In some areas, mobs formed and attacked Jewish neighborhoods, driving people out without any provocation or outright killing them. These acts of violence not only added more suffering but also made outside communities stop themselves from doing anything that could actually be helpful to the affected villages. Even when there were signs of what worked, like isolating the sick or avoiding crowded markets, peasants rarely had the ability or support to follow through. In many places, there was no one in charge of organizing a response. The church was already overwhelmed with prayer responsibility and trying to heal the sick, the nobles were either hiding or dying, and local leaders didn't have the tools or knowledge to stop the spread. Villages often had no records, official warnings, or guidance. Information traveled slowly, and most peasants only heard about the outbreak after it was too late. Some did try to copy what they'd seen work elsewhere, such as closing town gates, refusing travelers, or staying indoors. Still, without a collective and cooperative strategy, these efforts were disorganized and usually came too late. Then, since the plague could easily spread from one person to the next before symptoms even showed up, it kept outpacing whatever limited action the people were trying to take. All of this was a disaster. The disease itself was merciless, but it was the confusion, the fear, and the lack of options that turned it into a catastrophe for the people. Peasants weren't just facing a killer illness, they were also trapped in a world that gave them no tools to understand it, power to run from it, and help when it arrived. While the wealthy had space, supplies, and a way out, peasants had to face it head-on, with nothing but hope and trials to see what simple act of cure could work for them. How peasants fought hard to survive. Some peasants chose to lock themselves in. Families sometimes shut their doors and didn't open them for days. If they had food and clean water stored up, they tried to wait out the sickness. In some places, neighbors passed food through windows or left supplies at the doorstep, avoiding contact entirely. These makeshift isolations weren't perfect, but they worked well enough to keep some families alive, especially when people acted early. For some, local remedies were all they had, so they got creative. Since many believed the plague was caused by bad air, they tried to fight it with strong smells. Peasants boiled vinegar and soaked cloth in it, tying the fabric around their faces. They stuffed their pockets with herbs like rosemary, sage, and thyme. Some walked around with flowers or posies under their noses, hoping sweet scents would block out the deadly fumes. This is actually where the rhyme, "ring around the rosy," comes from. A pocket full of posies was more than just the song lyric we know now. It was a peasant's habit for survival. Others rubbed garlic on their skin or drank strange potions made from boiled plants. Some even believed cutting open the buboes or applying certain oils could draw out the poison. Most of it didn't work, but in a time like this, doing something, anything, was better than doing nothing at all. Religion presented its own means of survival too. Since science had no answers at the time, faith was where people turned. The peasants who believed the plague was punishment for sin doubled down on prayer. Churches were packed with people begging for mercy, and in some towns, religious processions marched through the streets. Some took it even further by joining certain circles called flagellant groups, made up of men who walked from village to village, whipping themselves with leather straps. They believed their suffering would convince God to spare the town. Others collected holy relics, wore crosses around their necks, or kept little bags of blessed soil sewn into their clothes. People visited shrines, lit candles, and made promises to live better lives if they were spared. This faith gave them some comfort, even if it didn't bring a cure, and for many, it was the only hope they had left. There were even moments of community survival. In rare cases, whole villages came together and took action. They sealed their borders, stopped travelers from entering, and set up their own versions of quarantine. One famous example, although it happened during a later wave of plague in 1665, is the village of Eyam in England. The people there chose to isolate themselves completely after the disease arrived, and while many still died, their sacrifice prevented it from spreading to nearby towns. Back in the 1300s, some medieval villages tried similar things on a smaller scale, like burning infected homes, refusing to bury the dead near drinking wells, or keeping outsiders away. Of course, these weren't official public health measures, they were just desperate decisions made on the fly, but sometimes they worked. Sadly, not everyone who lived through the plague did so because of effort or planning. Some people just got lucky. A few may have had natural immunity, possibly from earlier exposure to related illnesses. Others were spared simply because they lived in more isolated areas and didn't come into contact with infected travelers. They probably worked alone in fields or had fewer visitors at their homes, and sometimes all the members of different households survived for no clear reason at all. That's what makes the Black Death so terrifying. It was very unpredictable, You could do everything right and still die, or do everything wrong and somehow pull through. The peasants who survived often didn't have a reason why or an explanation of how. They just knew they were still breathing when others weren't, but even as people adapted, the plague didn't stop, so the real question is, how did this horror finally come to an end? How the Black Death faded but with no cure. By around 1351, the worst of the first wave had passed. Several factors played a part in that. One big reason was quite simple but very heartbreaking. So many people had already died that the disease kind of started to run out of new victims. This created an unintentional herd immunity because the most vulnerable had already been wiped out, leaving behind a population with more resistance. On top of that, seasonal weather changes also helped. The plague was spread by fleas, and colder winters meant fewer fleas around to carry the disease. In some areas, rats and fleas died off completely, breaking the chain of disease transmission. In towns and cities, some started to learn from the horror in small villages. Quarantines became more common and more organized. Infected households were sometimes isolated or even sealed off, and although peasants were usually the last to hear about new practices, some began copying what seemed to work in other villages. They stayed at home, avoided outsiders, or set up makeshift checkpoints. Local lords were desperate for workers to till their land and harvest their crops. That desperation gave peasants the leverage to demand better wages and improved living conditions. Over time, this shift began to chip away at the old feudal system, where peasants had been tied to the land with very little freedom. In a strange twist, a disease that nearly ended them also helped start the slow collapse of the system that had kept them poor and powerless for generations. Meanwhile, the plague never actually disappeared. Yersinia pestis still exists today, and every year a few cases pop up in parts of the world, including the US, but the difference now is medicine. A new world for medieval peasants. Thanks to antibiotics, a disease that once wiped out millions can now be treated and cured if caught early. So while the Black Death seems like a nightmare from the past, it still exists quietly in the background. The only reason it doesn't terrify us now like it scared medieval peasants is because science finally caught up. The question now isn't how the plague ended, but how much it changed the people who survived it. The trauma, loss, and chaos all left permanent marks, so you're about to see how the survivors during the medieval ages picked up the pieces and made a new life for themselves from the ruins. With half the population gone and peasants now bargaining for higher wages, shorter hours, and even the freedom to choose who they worked for, this change didn't sit well with the ruling class. Tension built up over the years, and it eventually reached the maximum point in revolts like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, where thousands of ordinary people rose to demand better treatment. It didn't fix everything overnight, but it proved that peasants weren't willing to go back to how things were before. Apart from the social and economic shifts, there was also a lot of endurance. Peasants had seen the worst, from death in every direction and fear in every village to losing their families, but they kept going. Some turned to faith, some leaned on family, and others simply focused on rebuilding what they had lost. Life didn't magically get easier, but there was more space to breathe, more chances to move up in the world, and more people willing to question the old rules. This spirit of survival and pushing forward even after everything fell apart became part of the story that medieval peasants carried with them. They may not have had books to record it or titles to pass down, but their endurance changed the course of European history. If you love this deep dive into medieval history, then hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Want another true medieval story like this? Comment below and let us know what you'd love to see next. Whether it's about fallen heroes, difficult lifestyles, or creepy realities, We've got a lot more in store for you.